Just to introduce myself first, my name is David Lesher. I am the Government Affairs Director at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California. I'm sure most of you are familiar or aware of PPIC, but we are a nonpartisan, independent think tank. We're based in San Francisco, but have offices here in Sacramento in the Senator Building, where I work with some of my colleagues. We do research on virtually all of the topics that cross the plate here in Sacramento, as well as a statewide survey about every month or so. And today, obviously, we are going to talk about our welfare population and some of the changes that have been proposed in the coming year. Just to outline the program for quickly, first we'll hear a presentation from Caroline Danielson, who I will introduce in a minute, and then we will bring up a panel that will include a couple of experts and practitioners in this area to answer some questions, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers from the audience. A couple of quick announcements before we get going. I wanted to say thank you to the James Irvine Foundation, which is a sponsor of the briefing series of which this presentation is a part. Also, an announcement about some of our upcoming events. On June 5th, we have an event about water and the economy, which is going to be very interesting. I've read the report. There is a lot to talk about with water, and it's really, I mean, frankly, it's fairly optimistic. It's very interesting news. But it's at the Sheraton, and it's going to last all morning from 8:30 to 1:30. You can register at the website, ppic.org. And then just want to mention it's in San Francisco on June 12th. We're hosting an event with Secretary of State Deborah Bowen to talk about the experience in the primary as we have the first experience with the top two vote-getter primary and the new districts that are going to be in place in this election as well. Also, a couple of announcements there. There's a little sheet on your chair that has an evaluation on it, and if you wanted to fill it out and drop it off on the desk in the back as you leave and tell us how we did, it'd be much appreciated. Also, this is being taped for broadcast, so if you want to avoid an embarrassing moment, you might silence your cell phones. So with that, I'll introduce Caroline and we'll get started with our program. Caroline is a policy fellow at PPIC whose research focuses on social safety net programs like nutrition assistance and welfare and child care subsidies. Before coming to PPIC, she was a principal analyst at UC Welfare Policy Research Project. She was a RAND graduate fellow and assistant professor of politics at the State University of New York. She has a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. So welcome, Caroline.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming today to talk about CalWORKs and to discuss CalWORKs. To start things off today, I'm going to talk both about some background and context for CalWORKs, the program, and then delve into the main highlights of the findings from the publication that you have on your chairs that we released earlier this month. CalWORKs is one of California's safety net programs. And by safety net, I mean programs that help individuals and families who are having difficulty making ends meet in a variety of ways. These can range from in-kind assistance like health insurance or subsidized health insurance or health insurance coverage to partly in-kind like food assistance, CalFresh food assistance benefits, to purely cash assistance. And CalWORKs is on the more cash assistance side, although as you'll hear and probably already know, there's an important component of services to the CalWORKs program as well. So it's an important piece of California's social safety net. It has two main goals. The first is basic income support for families with children. In order to be eligible, you need to be low income and have also few assets. An expensive car, a large bank account makes you ineligible. The program has a second longer-term goal of helping families to achieve or increase their self-sufficiency In other words, ideally to earn their way off CalWORKs, probably still relying on programs like the federal earned income tax credit and health insurance subsidies to make ends meet, but no longer relying on CalWORKs. And the second goal, the means of achieving that goal has been through providing welfare to work services and incentives for working among CalWORKs families. All that said, it's pretty clear that the poor population in California is much broader than the CalWORKs population. For example, in 2010, about 22% of California children lived under the federal poverty line. At the same time, about 12% of California children made use of CalWORKs in an average month. So implying that really the program is serving a portion of the poor population. Admittedly, poverty is a very rough guideline for eligibility for CalWORKs. It's not at all a precise measure, but to give it a rough sense. The program is not as broad as the problem of poverty. The program has been in place for less than 2 decades, and during that time there's been some substantial changes, both to the caseload and to the policies in place. In 1998, state policymakers created CalWORKs in response to a federal mandate that all states replace their aid to families with dependent children programs with what's known as temporary assistance for needy family programs, which is the federal name for the CalWORKs program. And states tended to create programs that emphasized work by instituting time limits on assistance and financial penalties for noncompliance with work requirements, so cutting grants, sanctions for parents who are not working enough hours. At the same time, providing additional work services, child care subsidies, transportation assistance, perhaps mental health treatment, and the like in order to help families find and keep work. CalWORKs is a distinctive program across the 50 states in the sense that the time limits that California has and the sanctions that California has don't affect the entire family. The more typical picture in the U.S. is that the entire family loses assistance when the parent times out. And the entire family is cut off if the parent is sanctioned. That's not true in California. And it's distinctive. I believe only 4 states have policies that are roughly similar to California's at this point in time. Before and after CalWORKs was created, the caseload was declining. Between 1995 and 2000, there was a steep decline that continued more slowly through 2007 from about 922,000 families in the mid-90s to roughly 460,000 families in 2007. So a 50% decline. It dropped in half. During the recession and after the recession that began officially in late 2007, it grew from 460,000 families to about 590,000 families in 2011. So a substantial growth, but not nearly to the height that it had reached in the mid-1990s. And California's program did grow more substantially than in other states. And this is not unexpected that it would have grown because the economy was so poor. Likewise, we would expect the caseload, and projections do anticipate that the caseload will begin to drop and is in the near future as the economy improves. At the same time, since the recession, the state has encountered budget difficulties that I'm sure you're all aware of, and the resources to achieve both of the 2 goals of CalWORKs have been reduced. This has taken the form of cuts to grants, shortening of time limits from 60 to 48 months for parents, and expansion of exemptions so that parents of young children who are primary caregivers of young children are exempted from the welfare to work aspect of the program. 2 pictures to illustrate. First is the average family grant over time. And you can see the top line is adjusted for inflation and the bottom line is unadjusted for inflation. And the fact that the bottom line is flat indicates that until about 2007, roughly flat, policymakers were not changing grants, but because prices were increasing, the inflation-adjusted amount of the grant dropped, the top line. Since 2008, there have been several bumps down, and this is both because of across-the-board grant cuts in 2 waves, and because parents have timed out more rapidly with a 4-year time limit, meaning that they're not eligible for assistance and the case grant tends to shrink. Looking at welfare to work services or the self-sufficiency aspect of the program, Work has been required of fewer parents, largely because there's been an expansion in the categories of exemptions for, as I've said, parents of young children. We estimate before the recent cuts, about 38% of parents were aided and required to work, so fully engaged in the welfare to work side of CalWORKs. By 2011-12, the current year, that had dropped to 25%. This is primarily because of the increased exemptions for families that have young children. It's also partly due to more parents reaching time limits after which they generally don't have full access to welfare to work services. There have been major changes over the past several years to the program, and Governor Brown is again proposing a major restructuring of the program, representing both budget cuts but also a refocusing of the program. So ending of has always been intended to be temporary expanded exemptions for families with young children, but also instituting a shorter time limit unless parents are meeting work requirements, so work activities hours targets, which are often either 20 hours a week or 30 hours a week. Sanctions will no longer, if a family is sanctioned, the time limit clock will no longer stop, so they'll still run out their clock. And there's a financial incentive if a parent is engaged in enough hours to meet their work requirement in unsubsidized employment. There's something of a financial incentive. Families will keep a little bit more of their grant. Finally, there's a substantial cut to grants if no parent is eligible. So for timed out parents, for families in which no parent has ever been eligible for assistance, there's an approximately 27% reduction as compared to the current year child-only grant. So the upshot is that the governor is proposing to refocus welfare to work services around those who are newer to aid, families who are newer to assistance, and to cut grants, but focusing the cuts on a particular portion of the caseload, which happens to be quite a large portion of the caseload, those in which no parent is aided. So given the shifting context, both in the past and now currently under consideration, it's important to have, we think, a more detailed understanding of who is on CalWORKs and how are they faring, and that was the main purpose of this report. What did we find? We found, not surprisingly, that CalWORKs families rely heavily on their CalWORKs grant, but at the same time, many CalWORKs families have actually relied on CalWORKs for a few years, not a long period of time. And those who are currently targeted by welfare to work services have higher earnings than parents as a whole who are on CalWORKs. At the same time, relatively few parents have part or full-time jobs. So I'll delve a little bit more into detail into each of these points. The main data source we used for the information that we provide in this report are called the TANF data reports, and every state submits them to the federal government as evidence of their compliance with federal work requirements that states have. That said, this report focuses not at all on the federal work participation requirement. Rather, we glean additional information about the circumstances of CalWORKs families from the kinds of information presented without a focus on the federal work participation rate per se. Like any data source, it has its strengths and weaknesses. It's a sample of about 3,400 families. It's from 2009. It's point in time rather than longitudinal, so there's no trajectory of how families are faring over time, how much their earnings change. But it is representative, and there is a sense of accuracy of the information. So CalWORKs families, they're not large. The most common size family number of children in a CalWORKs family is one. 41% of CalWORKs families in 2009 had one child. Because enough families have 3 children, the average is 2. 1.3 adults simply means that many families on CalWORKs are single-parent families. While families are not large, they tend to be young. About a quarter have a child under age 2, and an additional third, or nearly a third, have a child, the youngest child between age 2 and 6. So more than half of families have a child under school age. And most parents have low educational attainment. That means, all in all, over 90% are recorded. There's some gaps. So we focus here on the parents who are required in the first 4 years of their time limit and required to work. Among those parents, over 90% have a high school degree or less is their highest educational attainment, and fully 40% of parents do not have a high school degree. Families have a variety of sources of income. The main source, the largest source, is CalWORKs. Overall, family incomes in 2009 averaged a bit under $1,200 a month. To put that in context, the federal poverty guideline for 2009 for a family of 3, which is the average CalWORKs family size, was $1,526 a month, so below poverty. And CalFresh is not normally taken into account when establishing the federal poverty line, because it's considered non-cash. We consider it as close enough to cash to count it. But clearly, however you count their income, they're living under poverty. CalWORKs is the largest source of income, followed by CalFresh. Because this is 2009, the pie, all else equal, is probably smaller now, and the CalWORKs grant is a little bit smaller of a wedge because of the grant cuts. Earnings is the third largest source of income, and then followed by disability payments to both parents and children. Those are most often SSI. To delve a little bit more into earnings, although earnings are low, they are higher for the groups of families who are currently targeted by welfare to work services. So these are parents who are aided and who are in the first 4 years of their time limit. So the middle bar shows you months 1 to 24, so the parents who are in the first 24 months of their time limit, and then the end bar shows you parents who are in the 25th to 48th month of their time limit. And you can see that the 210 average across all families is much lower than the $333 and the $399 among the parents who are aided and required to work. And this difference is statistically significant. Looking at it from the point of view of hours of work, this is showing you the fraction of parents who have at least 1 hour of work. And here we're counting unsubsidized employment, and the darker bar on top is showing you some additional categories of work. Now, this isn't all work activities that are countable. It doesn't include, for instance, education. It doesn't include job search, importantly. What it includes are those that are unsubsidized and subsidized employment, and a couple of other small categories, but really work categories. And you can see, again, that a little over a quarter of all families have at least 1 hour of work, defined in the way we've defined it, but that's higher for families in the first 24 months of their time limit and highest for the families in the second 24 months of their time limit. It's also interesting to see that those additional categories, the additional categories of work in the gray slice of the bar is larger, proportionally larger for the families in the second 24 months of their time limit, suggesting that perhaps the welfare to work services are helping families to work in a greater variety of kinds of work. It's not clear that that's caused by the welfare to work services. It could simply be that those parents are more ready to work or able to work, but it could be that welfare to work services are helping them to engage in work more effectively. But when we look at this by whether the parent has enough hours to count as a part-time worker or a full-time worker, part-time being 20 to 29 hours a week and full-time counted as 30 hours a week or more, we see that less than half of families, even those who are in the first 4 years of their time limit and have full access to welfare to work services, well less than half of them have either part or full-time work. So it's from 15% overall, adding up both slices of the bar, to 26 and 30% if you look at the families in the first 4 years of their time limit. Finally, turning to time on CalWORKs, the length of time that a family has spent on CalWORKs. Although up until now I've been focusing on time clocks, so countable months towards CalWORKs, in this piece we look at, as best we can get, a simple count of the number of months a family has received cash assistance through CalWORKs. That's because time clocks can stop. They stop when the parent's not aided generally. And that means that if we want a broad picture of how long do CalWORKs families rely on the program, we need not to look at time clocks, but rather simply a count of months that they've gotten cash assistance. And that's what we do here. So this is showing the cumulative length of time on CalWORKs for a family, across all families. And it could be in one spell, so one stint on CalWORKs. It could be in a number of spells on CalWORKs. But overall, we see that for families currently on CalWORKs, almost half have a history of aid receipt that's 2 years or less. So CalWORKs is relatively transitory for many families. At the same time, almost 1 in 5, 18%, do have a history that's over 6 years. Doing a little bit of a subgroup comparison, and we're limited in how much we can do with subgroups because of the fact this is a sample. We're comparing here lengths of time on aid by educational status of the parent, and comparing those who have a high school education with those who lack a high school degree. And we see, interestingly enough, that in the shortest stays, so down near the bottom, the 10th percentile and the 20th percentile, the month's length of stay on CalWORKs is relatively short, and it doesn't differ across the subgroups, perhaps surprisingly. But it's 4 months in the 10th percentile. For slightly longer stays in the distribution, the 25th percentile, it's 9 and 10 months, so almost identical. But when we get up to the longer stays, those who have had the 75th percentile stay, so they're above the median, well above the median, or the 90th percentile stays, those with the longest stays, that's where you see the gap opening up, so that families who we might expect would have a more difficulty finding and keeping a job, those with less education, tend to stay on CalWORKs longer at the long end of the spectrum. So returning then to the themes, the theme of the two goals of CalWORKs, of immediate income support and of helping families to achieve self-sufficiency or increase their self-sufficiency. We find that families are really in immediate need. They have a low income and they rely heavily on their grant. At the same time, CalWORKs is a temporary experience for many families. And I think this is particularly evident with these data because we're looking at 2009, when the recession was had been in full swing and was just officially ending, but unemployment rates were not yet really going down at all. We see an increase in the caseload and an increase in those who are new to assistance, who have a little or no history of CalWORKs. And so that temporary nature of CalWORKs is more evident during recessionary times. But still, a substantial portion of families really have relied on CalWORKs for a few years or less. Because California continues assistance to most families, regardless of parents' actions, though, it appears that the issue of long stays deserves some more careful attention because families who stay on CalWORKs for long periods of time, that goal of self-sufficiency is one that's been difficult or impossible for them to achieve, and perhaps some additional measures to help families make ends meet or to ensure child well-being are worth policymaker consideration for those families who have particularly long stays, since California has made a decision to continue families on assistance, whether or not they can meet the self-sufficiency goal, which is not true in other states. In terms of the self-sufficiency goal, we find that really few parents, well less than half of parents work full-time. This is not necessarily surprising. CalWORKs is a program that we've seen is fairly temporary for many people. And when families find a steady job and are working full-time or nearly full-time, they tend to leave CalWORKs. So it's not necessarily surprising that those who are on CalWORKs at some point in time are not so many are working part or full-time. Because when they tend to exit. At the same time, we saw that parents who have been targeted for welfare to work services do work at greater levels, and they work in a greater variety of types of employment. And that suggests, although it's not conclusive, that perhaps welfare to work services are important for these families and are helping them to gain a toehold in the labor force. So going forward, Policymakers have engaged in a series of very difficult decisions in recent years, and they're asked again this year to consider further cutbacks. Not only, however, are cutbacks on the table, reducing the level of resources for the program, but also the balancing of the goals of CalWORKs. The kinds of cuts that are being envisioned are very different. Exempting families with young children is a very different kind of cutback to welfare to work services than focusing welfare to work services on those who are relatively new to aid in the first 2 years of their CalWORKs assistance. Focusing across the board grant cuts is very different than focusing grant cuts on families who have no eligible parents. So those are they're trade-offs in the policy goals of achieving income support and of self-sufficiency in the program, and policymakers, as they consider whether and how to restructure CalWORKs, need to be paying attention to the balancing of the goals as well as the level of resources that they devote to the program. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Caroline. And if I could invite our panelists to come up here, we'll transition to a couple of questions for responding to the presentation, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience. Just to introduce our panelists, there should be a more complete bio on the agenda that was on your chair. But we have after hearing this statewide overview of what the profile of the CalWORKs population is, we'll hear some of what it looks like at the ground level or maybe the county level in terms of the population and some of the issues that we're seeing. So our panelists to respond are Cheryl Davis, who is the Director of the Human Services Division for Placer County's Health and Human Services Department, and has worked in a number of human services positions, including some time here in Sacramento. And Noelle Simmons is the Deputy Director of Policy and Planning at the San Francisco Human Services Agency, and previously the Budget Director for Mayor Gavin Newsom and now Lieutenant Governor Newsom. So welcome, both of you, very much. Your help is appreciated. I have a couple questions just to open up. First of all, after looking at the profile of the CalWORKs population we saw from Caroline, I wonder if you could tell us how that compares with what you see in your counties, particularly in regard to the amount of time that people spend in the CalWORKs program and the work participation issues. So Cheryl, if you could start.
Certainly. Hello, everyone. Cheryl Davis from Placer County. When first asked to be here today, I read Caroline's report, and a little bit of history about Placer County, or demographics, not history, made me think that our numbers would be substantially different. Placer County, we're a medium-sized county, about 350,000 folks, residents, and we've been one of the fast-growing counties. We grew 40% since 2000, while the state grew about 10%. And we rank very high in a lot of socioeconomic and health indicators. We are above average in things like high school graduation rates, college degree attainment, home ownership, median income. And we are number one being a good thing, in child poverty. We have the least rate of children living in poverty in Placer. So again, I assumed, okay, we're going to be in good shape compared to this. Ran our numbers, and we are, the numbers were from 2009. As of April 2012 in Placer County, our numbers are very, very similar. Our CalWORKs population makes up about 1.2% of all of our residents. 3/4 of our population is children, the 1/4 being parents. Our average family size is 3.26. About 42% of our cases, though, our families are child-only cases, with 2/3 of those being non-needy relatives. And so of the balance of those 42, the 58% that we can try to enroll in welfare to work and try to help back into the workforce, 40% of those are exempt. So we do have a very small population, as you indicated, that we get to work with to try to get back into the workforce. What we saw mostly in Placer County when the Great Recession hit is that we were swamped with folks asking for CalFresh. Our CalFresh population grew 350%. Our CalWORKs population grew 25%. And what we were able to figure out from our demographics is that so many folks had unemployment benefits. They just needed to come to us for the food assistance. And some with Medi-Cal, our medical assistance, grew just about 35-40%. So clearly CalFresh was our demand. What we see with our population, is basically the same that you highlighted. We do have about 27% of our folks are working, and their average income is about $620 a month on top of what they do get from their CalWORKs grant. We have altogether about 27% of our folks have some sort of income, with the greatest percentage being earned income. Then there's unearned income, and then self-employment. But on the average, it's just about $400 a month for our families, bringing in outside resources on top of the CalWORKs grant. But one thing I thought we would see differently than what you showed up there, but we're seeing the same, is that our families, our adults who are registered in welfare to work, over 24 months have twice the rate of engagement in work activities, and primarily work, than our pre-24 months. So gives us a little idea about strategies in trying to, as you said, engage earlier on with our families. Our average time limit is about 13 months, with about three-quarters of our families currently are under 24 months. Only 10% have exceeded the 48 months in our child-only cases, so that leaves just about a quarter between the 24 and beyond rate there. But I think, surprising to me, because I actually expected, maybe given Placer's demographics and the wealth and good indicators, social and economic indicators of Placer, that we actually would have more families engaged than the general population. But our numbers are right on target. What we see anecdotally when we get in there is that even though our families are working, and especially post 24 months, they're not able to leave aid at this point in time. We see that our families are piecing together whatever part-time jobs they can get because of the economy to try to support their families as best they can. But we did have a very strong subsidized wage program under the Recovery Act. About 10% of our recipients were engaged in that. And as you noted, then those folks leave. Almost all but two were able to secure employment and leave. Two remained with us and had lost their jobs. But that's an incredible rate in this economy. And right now what we see primarily is just trying to get folks some semblance of full-time jobs that can pay a living wage, and they're just not out there. But our tool has been subsidized wage, and our plan is to continue to go large with that in the coming year.
Very interesting. So Noelle, how do things look in San Francisco? Are they different or similar?
Okay, great. I'll try to speak not just to comparisons to the report, but also to a little bit of what Cheryl said about Placer County. Just to give you the big picture, in San Francisco we have about 4,600 cases in CalWORKs currently. We didn't see a huge increase during this recession. We saw about maybe a 5% caseload increase during the first 18 months of the recession, but not as much as you might have expected given its severity. And I think that was kind of mirrored across the country, where we didn't see the TANF program being nearly as responsive to the recession as, for example, the food stamps program, where we also in San Francisco saw a much more significant increase in that caseload. And we did also notice in looking at our food stamps demographics that we were seeing many more families with children coming onto the food stamps caseload during the recession than we had seen previously. Previously, it was single adults without dependents who dominated that caseload. Since that first 18 months of the recession, the CalWORKs caseload has sort of resumed its downward trend in San Francisco, and our caseload is now below what it was immediately before the recession started. So of that 4,600 cases, about 70% of our caseload is what we consider to be welfare to work caseload. The other 30% are cases in which a parent is ineligible for aid. So it's a child-only case That 30% where a parent is ineligible almost exactly mirrors the statewide statistic that Caroline found in her report. And for those who aren't well versed in why a parent might be ineligible, it might be their immigration status, it might be a criminal background, it might be because the parent is a recipient of SSI, another federal benefit, which would make them ineligible for CalWORKs. In addition to that 30% where the adult is ineligible, we've got another 12% of our cases that are in the so-called safety net, meaning the parent has reached their time limit on aid, they're no longer eligible for a cash grant, but the child and the family remains aided. So when you put those two numbers together, it's about 40% of our caseload that's a child-only case, no parent on aid, and therefore not receiving welfare to work services that are the hallmark of this program. In terms of work participation, we currently have about 32% of our cases meeting the work participation rate. We've been focused on this a lot, as have other counties, so this is pretty much the highest that we've been at. We're very proud of that 32% rate. Of those who are not meeting the WPR, we have about 21% of our cases who are partially participating, meaning that they're engaged in some sort of allowable work activity, but not enough hours per week to meet that required WPR. So I think it was a little hard to know in looking at our numbers whether we were comparing apples to Caroline's calculations, but I think it looked like we had a somewhat higher work participation rate than the statewide numbers based on that. The other thing that jumped out to me as distinct in San Francisco is how families are meeting their work requirements. So I think Caroline's report found that unsubsidized work accounted for the greatest number of hours for most of her families. In San Francisco, for those families who are meeting their work participation requirement, 69% of them are actually meeting that through subsidized employment in San Francisco. Like Placer County, we really ramped up our subsidized employment opportunities when our stimulus funding was available for us to do so. Unlike other counties, San Francisco has managed to maintain a subsidized employment program, I think on a scale that other counties weren't able to once the federal funding for that activity dried up. Simply by virtue of being a better off county and one with a county board of supervisors that's politically willing to support that type of activity. And we found it to be extremely successful. I might stop there because we may come back to talking about work participation, but it's been a very successful strategy for us in San Francisco, and that's a point that I definitely wanted to emphasize.
Good, thank you.
I'll stop there, yeah.
I wanted to quickly touch on the governor's proposal, and basically the two elements of the time limit shrink going from 48 to 24 months, and for some populations, and the grant cut to the child-only cases. And just, what do you think, what kind of impact do you think that will have in your counties?
Sure.
You want to start, Noelle?
Sure, I'll start with that one. So in terms of taking the time limit reduction first, so as most folks probably know, we already had a time limit reduction from 60 months to 48 months that took place last year. In San Francisco, as a result of that policy change, we saw a 4 percentage point increase in our safety net caseload. So we had between, if memory serves, 250 and 300 families who pretty much immediately timed off of aid as a result of the decrease from 60 months to 48. We haven't completely run the numbers on this new proposal, but I think a significant percentage of our caseload, maybe around 40%, would not meet the full work participation requirement and therefore see their aid limit reduced to 24 months. So that's incredibly significant. That's a big chunk of people who would move off of the fully aided caseload and into the safety net. In terms of the reduction to the child-only grants, for those who aren't familiar with the proposal, the governor is proposing to reduce the child-only grant by 27%. So in a family where there's no aided adult, only the child is getting income support, grants would be cut by 27%. Right now in San Francisco, the maximum grant for a household with one child who's aided and no adult is $351, and under this proposal it would go to $256. So $256 a month, if you do the math, that means that those families would be getting about $3,000 a year in income support For those of you who are raising kids, you know, $3,000 a year doesn't go very far. So again, I think that would be a pretty significant blow to families who are already very much living on the margin. Did I get all of your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Cheryl and Placer?
Sure. I'm not sure I can add very much more. Just a little bit of Placer statistics. When the time limit went from 60 to 48 months, about 10% of our cases moved into the safety net only. Mm-hmm. And additionally, the income disregard went down, and we had about 10% of our families' income off of CalWORKs altogether at that time. Right now, we have about 27% of our families that are above 24 months, and again, based on who is engaged in work and work activities at the required hours, we believe almost 2/3 of those would fall into the safety net if it happened today. You know, of course, our efforts would be to engage folks and get them involved and try to meet their hours as best they could so that they could remain eligible for the programs. The difficulty about all of this is, you know, part of what's driving this is the poor economy and the lack of resources, but what's going to hinder our success with our families is the poor economy and the lack of employment opportunities out there for them.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if I could add one other thing, Dave, you didn't ask specifically about the proposed cuts in the child care arena, but I think that those are really significant as well in thinking about this population. So one of the proposals in the May revise is to reduce the rate at which child care providers are reimbursed for providing subsidized care. Currently, 85% of a regional market rate, proposed to be reduced to 40%. Particularly in high cost of doing business areas like San Francisco, even the current rate of 85% is not adequate to reimburse child care providers for the actual cost of providing care to families. So a reduction of more than half would effectively dismantle the child care infrastructure in San Francisco, and I imagine that the same would be true in many other parts of the state. Not many policy areas are simple. I mean, a lot of public policy areas are complex. It's pretty simple, though, the correlation between a parent's ability to work and their ability to access child care. If a parent does not have child care, they cannot work. It's almost that simple. And so we're very concerned if that child care cut goes through about what the implications are going to be, not just for our aided CalWORKs families, but for other low-income working families in the city.
Thank you. And Caroline, you talked about how the governor's proposal refocuses on the first 24 months or the beginners. Is there anything else that comes to your mind about the impact of the California's budget on the governor's proposals on the CalWORKs population?
So I think that the research we did, it's not really possible to know the answer to this question, but I think it's a key question to understand whether if you engage families up front, are you doing more good for those families, some of whom will be able to bounce back on their own, more or less, than if you focus worker services on families who are harder to serve, who may need more assistance. And how do you focus welfare to work services so that the program, in essence, has the most bang for the buck, so the people who could help themselves a little bit more on their own aren't the focus of the program, but rather it's the folks who really need the assistance of the program. And that's a very tough question to answer, but it does the focus on new to aid versus families with older kids is a really different focus, and I think it raises that question.
Just one last one before we open it up for questions. There's been discussion in the legislature about reconsidering the governor's proposal before the budget's adopted. And you just wondered, from your perspectives, as legislators or policymakers consider, the changes to this program. I mean, obviously, there's a huge budget deficit. There's a need to cut the budget. What do they need to know about the CalWORKs program as they consider how it should be adjusted or how it might be cut? Cheryl, do you want to start?
Certainly. I think Noelle did a very good job discussing the policy parts of it. Just one piece. Prior to coming back to Placer County, I've been in Placer County 3 years. I was the employment training director for the Department of Public Welfare in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And prior to that with Sacramento County, and I did not know it until I went to Pennsylvania, how complicated we have made our CalWORKs program, and then coming back, seeing it firsthand again, and some of the proposal is a family can be in this program and basic and And then we spend all of our time chasing our systems and the paper, and we neglect what our purpose is, which is to help our families. Pennsylvania was very simple. They just implemented the TANF law. It was called TANF. We did have a safety net program called extended TANF. There's only about 5 or 8 states that have the safety net type programs. And because we didn't have all that stuff and folks bouncing around, we were able to do very good analysis of our folks who needed help, and we were able to figure out that we had folks that were more readily employable, and we just had to get out of their way and provide work supports and job leads and some job development. And then we had our population that needed more intensive case management, education, work experience. And then we had our population that we more than likely weren't going to get to work, that we had to shore up the family, and we were devising programs to deal with each of those. And we could spend our time doing that as opposed to wondering if this month this person's in basic or this month they're going to be in premium. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the names. But just to make it simple for us to do our jobs beyond the policy issues. If that helps.
That's interesting. Yes, helpful. Noelle?
Yeah, I mean, things to keep in mind. I guess one thing I would say is to remind our policymakers that 3/4 of the individuals who are aided through the CalWORKs program are children. So the governor's proposals has been framed as refocusing the CalWORKs program on work, and that's important, and I want to be very clear that I don't think we should be abandoning the idea of work engagement or moving families towards self-sufficiency. But I think we also at the same time need to keep in mind that this is the primary income support program for poor children in California, and we need to be thinking about outcomes that are related to child well-being and what kinds of futures are we creating for the poor children who are on this caseload. The children are not going to work, and so with all the focus on work strategies for parents, what are we doing around child well-being through this program as well? I mean, that's the main thing I guess I would say to keep in mind. One other point I guess that's important is that this is a long-term recovery that we're experiencing from this recession. I mean, California still has 11% unemployment as compared to, I think, 8.2% nationally. So how are we thinking about the goals of the CalWORKs program in a time of high unemployment where even for people who are playing by the rules, there simply may not be a job out there for them to take? And so how is the program flexing to meet that reality?